Professor,
Professor.
summer is over and it's back to school time, which makes it the perfect moment to launch a new podcast as everyone settles into fall routines. Welcome to the first episode of Power and Purpose. I'm Amanda Sloat, a new professor at IE University in Madrid, Spain, and former advisor to President Biden.
And I'm Nathalie Tocci, a new professor at SAIS in Bologna, Italy, and a former advisor to EU High Representatives Federica Mogherini and Josep Borrell. So given the toxicity in politics these days, it's easy to forget the people behind the headlines. So in this podcast, what we really want to do is explore the human side of global leadership.
So Power and Purpose will feature conversations with former senior government officials and leaders exploring the people behind the headlines. But before we start interviewing guests, we wanted to use this first episode to introduce ourselves and answer some of our own questions. We come from opposite shores of the Atlantic, providing European and American perspectives. And in addition to being great friends, we followed a similar career trajectory as we both served at senior levels in our respective governments and institutions, worked in think tanks, and are both starting new roles as professor of practice. So, Nathalie, as we're going to ask our guests how they got into policy, what was your journey getting in?
So my journey, Amanda, was, as I think most journeys, in some respects, a pretty random one. What was not random was that I think I am, as a person, someone that has never really fully felt comfortable completely in the world of academia or completely in the world of practice. And I've always understood myself as someone really straddling these different worlds. So in terms of how I actually got into the more policy side of things, as I said, I think it was a fairly random journey in the sense that when Federica Mogherini, that incidentally, and I'm giving a bit of a spoiler here, will actually be our first guest on this podcast. When she was nominated High Representative of the European Union, I was previously, as when she was Foreign Minister, working with her in the Foreign Ministry for a while. And so, it kind of was natural in some respects for me to move on and perhaps go and serve in her cabinet in Brussels. But because I'd actually lived in Brussels before, and I wasn't, to be honest, very keen on returning. I mean, there are all sorts of also family, personal reasons behind these choices, as we're going to be discussing in this
and it
podcast.
It
rains all the time. So I really wasn't keen on this at all. And so, it was just one of these things where the heart said no, but the brain said yes, and I didn't quite know what to do. And then, randomly at a conference, a colleague said to me, well, Nathalie, do you know actually that there are these roles of a special advisor, and it doesn't actually require you to be in Brussels the whole time, and you can be a little bit in and a little bit out. And I said to myself, oh, that's me, And so I proposed it to the newly appointed High Representative at this stage. And she said yes, and that's how it all began. But how about you, Amanda? I mean, how does a girl from Michigan end up in the White House?
I similarly random like you. I find your journey somewhat interesting because in the US and in Washington, I think it's quite common for people to move in and out of government if you go the political appointee track rather than being a career diplomat or a career official. And I know Europeans are sometimes envious of Americans for the ability to do that, because there definitely are times where it's nice to be in government and serving. And then it's also nice to have times where you step back, catch your breath, as you say, focus on family and other things. And also reset your brain and do some reading and writing and thinking about things. For me, I tell people I'm a poster child for how study abroad can change your life. I grew up in Michigan, was not interested really in international politics, and then came between my third and fourth year of university and spent a month in London, a week in Edinburgh, fell in love with Scottish politics, and then a PhD led to a postdoc, and then eventually went back to the US to try and serve my country, and did stints in Congress, the State Department, and then the White House most recently. So really, Europe has always been my passion, and it's been exciting to be moving back to Europe now this year. But want to talk to the people that have made a difference to the world and who can inform and encourage our listeners. I think both of us are going to be very conscious of that, dealing with students who are considering public service careers, We obviously continue to have a lot of colleagues working in international relations who want to learn from the best, and I think are very aware that there's a lot of people right now who are cynical about politics and need a reminder of its better nature.
Totally. And in fact, we did call this podcast Power and Purpose precisely because we think that at its best, these are two sides of the same coin. We really want to explore the connection between these things, what drives individuals, what drives them to contribute to policy, to navigate power, but also how they did this and how they did this by bringing in their own personal stories, their choices, their doubts. What is the human side in the sense of holding these positions of power?
Absolutely. So it's going to be a great way for us to fangirl with a bunch of people that we really admire. Our plan is to launch new episodes every other week, and in each episode, we'll interview a former senior government official, leader, someone doing really interesting public service work, touching on current political events at the beginning, because obviously there's a lot going on, and our guests are going to have a lot of expertise, but also really getting to know the people rather than the job titles. And as we've just shared ourselves, we'll ask guests to reflect on their successes and failures, how they stayed healthy in their high stress jobs, and what it takes to lead during moments of uncertainty.
And perhaps one further thing that we should say at this point is that what we also want to do in this podcast is focus in particular on women and women leaders and the role that they have played in international relations. So this is not a women-only podcast, because we will now and then invite some men as well. But I would say that it's a women-mainly podcast, because we really feel that there is still insufficient, but obviously, thankfully, a growing group of absolutely extraordinary women that have made incredible contributions to policy and to international relations. And so we really think that their stories are still insufficiently known, and knowing them can actually help us understand both about the past, present, and future, but also to provide a real insight to listeners as to how indeed to look at power and purpose as two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. I'm curious with everything you mentioned and all of the things you've done, is there a moment or an achievement that stands out to you that you're most proud of?
Well, actually something we share, one of the many things that we share is indeed Europe is my passion too. And I guess my proudest moment in that respect is the work that I did on the European global strategy. So this was indeed when I was special advisor to Federica Mogherini. And the EU hadn't had basically a security strategy for a long time, in the sense that the previous one, which had been the first and only one, was written back in 2003. And, back in 2003, as the opening lines of that strategy said, Europe had never been so prosperous, so secure, or so free. And by the time we get to 2014, 2015, very clearly, we weren't very prosperous after the Eurozone crisis. We weren't very secure after the annexation by Russia of Crimea and, terrorism in Europe. The freedom bit, it was beginning to crack there too, with the rise of populism across the continent, and of course in the United States as well. And so it really felt important to have a new document that member states and EU institutions could agree on to, in a sense, provide a compass for the way forward. And so I proposed to the High Representative that we work on such a document, and she agreed. And essentially, that's what I did when I was special advisor. And, here we are in 2025. There has not been another EU global strategy. So it's still, 10 years on, the one that survives. And a number of concepts in that document, including, resilience, a big focus on defense, are in many respects still relevant, or perhaps even more relevant today. So I guess that's one of the things that probably stands out most to me. But But how about you,
Yeah,
Amanda?
I was going to
Yeah.
ask how much of that stands the test of time.
Um,
You could make the case that Europe is showing questionable resilience with the further invasion of
yeah.
Ukraine, rising populism. How does that document look now?
Yeah, I mean, in many respects, obviously the world has changed tremendously, right? But in terms of what is it that we have to do as Europeans about it, in some respects, you could say, well, the point is that it was precisely about, not so much, resilience meaning we are resilient, but resilience meaning we have to become resilient. And we're not sufficiently resilient, or we've got to invest more on defense. So it's as if what is in that document, precisely because it's not as if it wasn't done, it simply wasn't done enough. And of course, the change of the context means that it has to be done on steroids, and the deterioration of that context that in some respects makes it still relevant to today. But I mean, tell me a little bit about your proudest moment, perhaps as is relevant to transatlantic relations.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think in terms of documents produced, when I was in Congress, I passed one piece of legislation, and it gave diplomatic immunity to officials serving in the international organizations in Bosnia, in the Office of the High Rep, and then also in the ICO in Kosovo.
Mm,
So that was something I felt really proud of because it actually made a tangible difference to officials working there and protected them from political attacks or being sued. On a very personal level, my proudest moment was being in Belfast, Northern Ireland with President Biden. He had long wanted to visit Ireland, his family homeland. He had been a passionate defender of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was a place I randomly landed in 2001 to do my postdoc. Was the only place
oh,
I could get
really?
a
You did
job.
your? I didn't know that. So you did your postdoc in Northern Ireland.
I did. I
Wow.
did. It was the only place I could get a job. I did my stage in Brussels. I wanted to work in Brussels, but I was an American who only spoke English and needed a work permit, which did not make me a particularly competitive candidate.
Mm,
So ended up in Northern Ireland, and I moved there before 1 week before 9/11.
wow.
My mother, everybody was very nervous about my safety in Northern Ireland. 9/11 happened. Nobody again worried about me in Northern Ireland. But it was only a couple of years after the Good Friday Agreement, still lots of security issues on the ground. And so Northern Ireland became a bit of a passion project for me over the subsequent years. I really got emotionally invested in the place. I did a lot of work on the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland when I was out of government during the first Trump administration. And so to be there with President Biden, marking the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, really was a full circle moment
Yeah.
for me. It brought me back to this first job I had coming out of school. It brought me back to a place I cared about, and also was positive to see the region moving in a much better trajectory. So, like I said, Northern Ireland was a place that I never expected to live, but it really ended up shaping, in many ways, the next 20 years of my career in
Mm.
terms of academic and political work that I did. So, I'm curious if you had similar things that you didn't expect, or things that were negative at the time, or detours that ended up being positive in the end.
Yeah. Well, in an odd kind of way, I guess the unexpected detour was the product of the fact that for me, actually, everything went far too much according to plan. So, I've been always sort of, fairly hardworking, sort of big sense of responsibility. Oh my God, I've got to save the world kind of person. And I was really like this, really since a very young age. And things worked out. What do I mean by things worked out a little too well? In the sense that I, literally had a very full agenda with never really having sort of any time out in terms of whatever, gap years or what have you. And so things worked out a little too well, to the extent that I kind of, really drove myself into the ground and ended up, and this was about, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, so not too long ago, ended up with an absolutely dreadful burnout. And I think that burnout was precisely the product of the fact that things had worked out up until then far too well. And so I never really had, in a sense, that little blank space, in which the unexpected can happen. And so actually, it was a product of that burnout that I changed really rather significantly the way in which I go about my work. So I still kind of work on the same things. I still have the same passions, but now I take a lot more time out for myself. And, in particular, I take a lot more time out to do things that are not related to work, like my martial arts, for example. So, yeah, I mean, I guess, my unexpected turn was the product of things being a little bit too expected. And I'm grateful that eventually that unexpected happened. But how about you, Amanda? I mean, have you had moments in which, indeed, there was that unexpected detour, things didn't quite work out how you had planned, and all sorts of new opportunities emerged as a result of that?
Yeah, I mean, I really related to what you were saying on the burnout piece.
Mm.
Another area where you and I have followed very similar trajectories. And I think really when I start talking to a bunch of my girlfriends, I realize we're all very type A and working too hard. And I am going to say, you told me just before we started this podcast, you were screeching in from the airport off a conference, and I think both of us still have those type A
Yeah.
tendencies in us,
Yeah.
even though we're trying to do better. But no, I think I had a very similar experience. I've taken 3 sabbaticals now following my government jobs. When I left Congress, I took a period of time off. When I left the State Department, following really intense work in the Obama administration, where I was responsible for U.S. policy on Turkey at a time of the war in Syria, the rise of ISIS, the refugee crisis, I needed time off to reset. And then the most dramatic one has come following my 3 years in the White House.
Mhm.
And I had gone into that job with really good intentions to try and stay healthy. I was going to do yoga every morning. I was eating really healthy food. I was trying to get enough sleep at night. But the reality is, as you know well, is these government jobs are very intense and
Yes.
very stressful. And I had a resting heart rate of 98 beats per minute when I left the White
Not
House,
good.
which when the doctor told me that, I just, it just was symptomatic of how jacked up I felt
Mm.
all the time. And like you, I also never took a gap year. I went straight from undergrad to my PhD to intern to postdoc. And I missed all the fun that our students seem to be having now. And so a year ago, I bought myself a one-way plane ticket, flew to New Zealand, and spent a year just traveling, which really was a fantastic opportunity to reset, to process a lot of things, to develop healthier habits, to have fun, exploring the world. And then all of that ended up leading me to this job in Spain. And I think, like you, at least with the intention of having a calmer existence, or at least a better sense of work-life balance.
Yeah.
So I know that you have been dealing with your stress through Kung Fu, which makes you, I think, one of the most badass people I know. So how did you get into? I've never actually heard the story of how you got into Kung Fu.
Well, okay. I mean, okay. The real story goes as follows. I was 11 years old, and I
Oh, it
got
goes back that far.
absolutely, and I got a terrible crush on a guy, and he did,
That's always the way.
and he did judo. And so I thought to myself, how is it that I can get noticed? And so I just kind of thought, I've got to do judo as well. But there was no judo, basically, near my home. And actually, there was only taekwondo. So I actually started off my martial arts with taekwondo, which I did until after the end of my university. So I did, taekwondo for, about 10, 15 years. And And I was quite
Wait, but what
serious.
happened to the boy? Did you get
I
noticed?
completely lost interest. I took a lot of interest in taekwondo, and yeah, I mean,
Moved on to better
the
things.
boy kind of fades out of my memory at this stage. But he obviously he doesn't know. In fact, I hardly remember his name. But very clearly, he played a very significant role in my life. Although I can't remember who he is. Anyway, so I was kind of very serious about my taekwondo, but taekwondo is a lot about kind of kicking. I mean, the whole competitive side of things, which, of course, when you're in your teens and your early 20s, I mean, it's a lot of fun. And actually, it's a fun even when you're in your kind of late 40s, as I am now, in the sense that, in Thailand.
But you got more things you want to kick
Exactly.
at.
I mean, I was in Thailand with my son last month, and we went and did a Muay Thai, a Thai boxing camp, which was a lot of kicking and punching. Anyway, so back to Taekwondo. I did that, as I said, for about 10, 15 years. And then, by the time I got into my mid-20s, I was into kind of, sort of learning something that was a little bit more, how can I put it, more comprehensive, less focused exclusively on the external side of things. And basically that's what Kung Fu is. There are internal styles of Kung Fu like, Pacquiao, Tai Chi, and probably Tai Chi is the one that most people are more familiar with, which actually is Kung Fu, that are really, very close to, meditation and, yoga and, sort of, and I think, as I went on in life, I just kind of thought I need that side of things as well. And, today my Kung Fu and my practice is really a way for me to sort of find those blank spaces, and it's in those blank spaces that ultimately new ideas, new inspirations, or simply just kind of switching off really happens. So I think for everyone it's for me it's martial arts. For some people it's walking, but everyone I think really does need to have that kind of little secret garden for oneself.
Totally.
And I think it's so important. And I know your little secret garden, Amanda's yoga. So tell me about that.
I know. My not so secret. And I should also tell listeners who know you for your profound writings in international newspapers that you also have a book on Kung Fu, which we will have to link in the show notes if you have inspired anyone to take up the practice. Absolutely. For me, it was yoga, and somewhat similar. I did gymnastics when I was little. Like every American child of my age, I was going to be the next Mary Lou Retton and compete in the Olympics, and started to have injuries and the rest, and then left that path, but still really enjoyed standing on my head and doing back bends, and so yoga has sort of been gymnastics for adults. And I've really found it a way to not only with the physical practice, maintain a sense of flexibility and exercise, but really appreciated a lot of the zen and the calm and the focus that comes along with that. And so, have continued to do yoga on a regular basis. During the pandemic, I started a daily 10-minute practice every morning. I would love to do an hour every morning, but I knew, especially during my White House days, that was not going to be realistic. But 10 minutes in the morning, there's lots of excellent resources online, is very doable. And often it's the best part of my day, where I just start in a very calm and focused way. And want to give a short plug actually to IE University, that's established a Center for Health and Well-being to help students develop awareness and skills. I think certainly for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume for you, this just wasn't something that was really talked about when we were in university, this sense of work-life balance and health. And I think it's something you and I want to get into on this podcast and talk about with leaders, how they've managed it. All of us, I think, could use a little more yoga and Kung Fu in our lives.
And as you say, I mean, I think it's one of the primary reasons why we're doing this podcast. Hopefully, many of our listeners will actually be much younger than us. and looking into how to explore a career in policy and practice. And what, broadly speaking, would be your top advice to them looking ahead?
Yeah, so I've now had my first class. So I have gotten over my back to school nerves and met with my students for the first time. And I have to say, I was concerned about how they would be viewing the world, given how toxic politics are. And so I was quite heartened that the vast majority of students in my classes are interested in international relations and some form of public service. I have to say, not a lot of them were interested in serving as elected representatives, but there was a lot of interest in the nonprofit sector, in diplomacy, and in ways of really trying to understand and connect and engage people. And one of the biggest pieces of advice that I gave them, have given students in the past, and I think it's really reflected in both of our experiences, is just staying open to different
Yeah.
opportunities.
Yeah.
My dad used to say to me, sometimes it's as important to work out what you don't want to do as it is what you do want to do. I certainly never expected to go to Northern Ireland. It was a dream to be in the White House. I had not envisioned myself living in Spain. I foolishly stopped studying Spanish when I was in university. And I think you just don't know where life is going to take you. And so I think you need to be prepared to be the right person in the right place at the right time. And, get the education, have the experiences. But I think you really need to stay open to the randomness and the beauty of the world. And because you just never know where some of your career trajectory is going to lead. So what are you going to tell your students?
I think it's actually rather similar to what you just said, in the sense that, I keep on coming back to this image of the blank spaces. I used to have a doctor who was actually more of a philosopher, to be honest, than a doctor. He once said to me, "You're like a painting full of color." Yeah, there are no blank spaces on this tableau. And it's all color, 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 color. And you just need to carve out that white, you need to carve out those blank spaces. And it's only once there are those blank spaces that you can figure out whether you want to keep them white, or whether you want to paint them in red, green, or blue, right? But if everything is absolutely crammed with color already, you actually think that you're making choices, but the choices are actually being made for you. And so I think, the flip side of the coin of remaining open, and that means providing yourself with that space to actually make choices. So I guess my main advice at times is doing less at times ends up meaning doing more. And that's how you, sort of to the extent possible, provide a steer to your life, and while remaining open to its unpredictability, I guess.
No, I love that. I love that. That idea of blank spaces is beautiful. Well, you and I obviously could continue talking for hours and hours in this podcast, and we'll have the opportunity to do that with our guests in the future. So just to bring it back to the podcast, I think to put it very simply, we want to share stories about people who have inspired us, and so we've tried to provide a little bit of our stories here in this first episode. In addition to providing a peek behind the curtain, we hope that this podcast reminds listeners that purpose-driven leadership remains possible. And in a world that's filled with so much political polarization, wars, and economic difficulties, it's also important to focus on the positives. I found when I talk to friends back in the US, it's very easy to exchange stories about challenges and problems that we're facing. But a friend of mine recently in one of our conversations said to me, "What brought you joy this week?" So Nathalie, as we are wrapping up, what brought you joy this week?
Actually, I've just come back from holiday. As I told you, I was in Thailand, then in Laos and Vietnam. And what brought me joy, actually, just a couple of days ago, because I was still in Vietnam, was a train journey. back from Sapa in northern Vietnam to Hanoi, where I had my return flight. And I ended up having a long conversation with a lady that was actually traveling from Sapa to Hanoi for the national celebrations. Vietnam has its Independence Day on the 2nd of September. And so, obviously Vietnam is a country that has gone through, frankly speaking, quite a lot of shit, right? Over the last couple of centuries. I mean, wars left, right, and center, total devastation. And, this was not an intellectual. She was not a policy wonk in any shape or form. But we ended up having this rather deep conversation about how, at some point you really need to turn a page on the past and look ahead and get over resentments. And as I said, this wasn't an intellectual conversation. And so it's not really a reflection about government and Vietnam or what have you, but it's really something, and, the lady is just one example, but I got the same sense from, Grab drivers and tourist guides and whatnot, about people that have really turned a page on the past and are really looking to the future with a lot of optimism and hope and joy, right? I mean, going back to the question about joy. So that gave me a lot of joy listening to her talk to me. But what about you, Amanda?
No, that's amazing. I had a very similar experience. I went the opposite direction from you for my holidays. I was in Southwest Africa and did a 3-week overland trip, spent a lot of time in Namibia, which if listeners are looking for vacation destinations, I can highly recommend. Spectacular. A sunrise at the dunes, a safari, seeing animals. And like you, I had the opportunity to engage in a lot of really meaningful conversations with local people. I spoke to a Herero woman in Namibia. I spent an afternoon hanging out with 2 women working in a cafe in Swakopmund and exchanging stories about, dating advice and how dating works in Namibia, and comparing American men and Namibian men.
Wow.
And then like you, I was in Cape Town and I did a tour of one of the townships because I really wanted to understand the history there and how things were progressing. And I ended up being alone on this walking tour, and the guide was really lovely. He kept jokingly putting his hand on my arm to slow me down, because even on vacation, my inclination was to power ahead and walk. But he would link his arm through mine and say, he wanted to walk as friends, and he wanted to walk through the township, including with a white foreign woman, to show the people there that it is possible to continue healing and to continue moving forward. And so, like you, it was a great opportunity to get away from my area of focus and study, to explore another really beautiful part of the world, and to engage with some really lovely people.
Amazing.
I will thank you to all of our listeners for joining us. We will be back with our first full episode very soon, featuring an inspiring woman leader, which if you were listening closely to Nathalie, you may have gotten a hint, with great stories and lessons learned. Nathalie and I are both very excited about our growing list of amazing people that we plan to feature on future episodes. Power and Purpose is an IE Insights podcast produced in association with IE University and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Production and sound design by Reptile Studios. We'll be back soon with the next episode. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Power and Purpose wherever you get your podcasts.